You were taught farming came first. This carved face says otherwise. Staring out of solid rock for 12,000 years, the people who made it had no farms, no pottery, no metal, no wheel, no writing, nothing we would call civilization. They were hunter-gatherers, and then they built a temple before they ever planted a field. For 100 years, we taught the exact opposite. First the farm, then the gods. This one hill says we had the whole story backwards. The temple came first. Its name is Karahan Tepe, and we have uncovered barely 5% of it. The strangest thing here is still in the ground. What has already surfaced rewrites where civilization began, and what is still buried may rewrite why. Karahan Tepe lies in the dry hills of Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey, about 40 miles from the more famous site you may already know, Göbekli Tepe. For years, Gobekli stood alone, a single temple that seemed far too old and far too skilled for hunter-gatherers, but then archaeologists looked harder at the hills around it. Karahan Tepe was first noticed in 1997, yet the real excavation only began in 2019. Led by the archaeologist Necmi Karul, what emerged was not one strange temple, but the edge of something much larger. Rows of T-shaped pillars, more than 200 recorded on the surface alone, and chambers cut straight down into the bedrock. And here is the detail that should stop you. After years of digging, they have uncovered only about 5% of the site. So how old is it? And why does it break the rules? You have heard the claim. To feel how heavy it is, you have to remember the story it overturns. For most of the last century, the birth of civilization had a clean, tidy order. First came farming. People learned to plant grain, so they stopped wandering and settled down. Settling created a surplus, more food than they needed. Surplus bought leisure and specialists and power, and only at the very end of that chain, once people were fed, organized, and ruled, did they build the great things, the temples, the monuments, the gods. Farm first, faith last. It made perfect sense. Every textbook agreed. Then they dated Karahan Tepe. It was raised around 11,000 years ago by hunter-gatherers who lived by following the animals and gathering wild plants. Before pottery, before metal, before the wheel, before farming, everything we were certain had to come first. The surplus, the settlement, the rulers came after. And the more they dig, the worse it gets for the old story. And Karahan Tepe is not alone. It belongs to a whole landscape the Turkish teams call Taş Tepeler, the stone hills. Around a dozen related sites scattered across the same region, raised by the same world of people across centuries. Göbekli Tepe was never a single miracle. It was one hill in a network of them. Sit with what that means. This was not one lucky genius, one freak temple. It was a culture, a shared way of building, carving, and coming together, spread across the land, all of it before agriculture. People with no cities and no kings were meeting on these hills, moving pillars that weigh as much as several cars, and setting them with care, again and again, hill after hill. We are not looking at an accident before history. We are looking at a lost world that came before the world we thought was first, and we have barely opened the door. Step closer, and Karahan Tepe stops feeling like architecture and starts feeling like a mind. In one chamber, rows of carved pillars rise straight from the bedrock floor, watched over by that great human head set into the wall, its neck craning, as if it has just turned to look at you. Nearby once stood a figure more than 7 feet tall, a stone man unearthed in 2023, ribs showing, hands clasped over his own body, his face caught somewhere between grief and warning. There are vultures cut from stone and human heads, and from this same region, an even older figure, the so-called Urfa man, who may be the oldest life-size statue of a human being ever found, his eyes two beads of black obsidian that have been staring for 11,000 years. These people did not only build. Before they could farm, before they could write, they carved themselves, their bodies, their fears, their dead, into the rock and left them in the dark to keep watch. So here is the question Karahan Tepe forces on us, and it is bigger than the order of two events. What if we have the cause backwards too? The archaeologist who first dug Göbekli Tepe, Klaus Schmidt, came to believe something startling, that it was not the farm that made the temple, but the temple that made the farm, that the need to gather, to meet at a sacred place, to build something together far larger than any family, to feed the crowds who came, may be what first held people in one spot long enough to tame the wild grain already growing on these very hills. In that view, civilization did not begin with a full stomach. It began with a shared idea. First, we came together to believe. Then, to stay together, we learned to farm. Now, this is still a hypothesis, a leading idea, argued over, not settled. Karahan Tepe will not prove it alone, and careful archaeologists disagree about what these chambers were truly for. But the hard facts by themselves are enough to humble us. Monumental architecture, raised by hunter-gatherers before agriculture, that part is real, and it overturns a story we taught with total confidence for 100 years. We were certain civilization began in a field, with a surplus of grain. Then a hill in Turkey carved with a watching face answered, "You started in the wrong place. The temple came first." So the deepest truth of Karahan Tepe is not in the stone we have uncovered. It is in the 95% we have not. A lost world still waiting under the soil that already knows our origin story was told in the wrong order. And Karahan Tepe is only one of the stone hills. A dozen more sit under those same dry slopes, barely touched, each one perhaps holding another face, another chamber, another piece of the world that came before our own. We will be back on these hills, because 12,000 years on, we can trace every line carved into that first face, and we still cannot tell you what it was waiting for. I'm June, and this has been The Hour, where we keep a light on for the things the world let itself forget.